Hey, this is Jim Sedore. I am your personal Bible teacher, and you're listening to the Bible Exposition channel. Hey, good morning to all my friends and listeners out there. You got Jim here, and we are getting ready once again to rightly divide the word. And I don't know how many of you know the fact that that term, rightly dividing the word, is something that is a Pauline term. It's something that originated with the Apostle Paul. And there's a good reason for that. What it means is when Paul was given all of those new mysteries out in the Sinai desert, during those 3 years of his seminary training with the risen Lord Jesus Christ, Paul recognized the fact that the stuff that he was going to be preaching was so different than the stuff that they had been preaching previously about the kingdom gospel and the coming of the Messiah. So it was important for his readers and his followers to understand that they needed to rightly divide the word. So that's where that comes from. But how many of you guys took time to watch the History Channel's presentation of the life of Jesus this past Monday evening? I thought I would give it a shot just to see how badly they wrecked it. It's the same people that put out the Bible last year, and they totally demolished that. So I was watching, and I was fairly interested for about the first half hour until they turned the camera onto one of their commentators, and that commentator was Joel Osteen, one of the most prolific false teachers, false prophets in the entire so-called Christian church. So you just got to be careful. You got to be careful out there because, the devil roams around looking for whom he can devour. And Joel Osteen is not somebody I want to take biblical commentary from. So, what are we going to do today? Well, we're studying these 3 books in the Bible, right? We got the book of Romans, Genesis, and Hebrews, and today we're going to continue in Romans. And we're going to begin in a chapter that is near and dear to my heart, because Romans 10:9 is my salvation verse, and I think you all know it, that if you say with your mouth that Jesus Christ is Lord and you believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Pretty simple, right? Very, very different than what I was taught growing up as a Catholic, that you had to do all this stuff. So, let's get into it first, and I want to just make a little mention to the fact that Chapter 10 is going to be dealing with salvation. Chapter 9 was dealing with Israel's past, but this chapter will deal with Israel in its present-day dispensation. And Paul makes it so clear back in Romans 3 that now that everything's been accomplished at the cross, that he has to now go out into the Gentile world, and there's really no difference between that and the Jew. And I cannot emphasize that enough. A Jew does not have to give up his Jewishness, but they do have to separate themselves from all of that Old Testament stuff, that Old Testament economy, because this is so new. This is so much better, as Paul wrote in the book of Hebrews. This whole idea of grace, with nothing to do with law. That was all settled at the cross. You know, there's a verse in Colossians that I love that it says, blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, and took it out of the way, nailing it to the cross. Well, Paul is saying there that the law, which was everything to the Jew, is now gone. Colossians 2:14, I'm sorry. So today's Jew is under no different situation than any Gentile as far as God's concerned, and you gotta understand that. Since chapter 10 of Romans is dealing with the Jew in this present age, it just stands to reason that everything in chapter 10 also has application for us as Gentiles. That's why we offer this chapter so often in our salvation verses, because it's no different for us than it is for the Jews. Salvation is now offered to everyone on the same level playing field. Jews don't have any advantage over Gentiles any longer, nor are they disadvantaged. We're both alike. We're all under sin. We all need salvation. There is no difference. So here in Romans 10, Paul is trying to emphasize that so many of Christendom, so many Christians have the opinion that God's all through with the Jew. It's taught in 90% of the pulpits out there. They call the Jews the Christ killers because they rejected the Messiah. But they didn't kill Jesus Christ on their own. They were complicit with the Romans. Just look at what Psalm 2 says. So, God sent them into dispersion. He destroyed their temple. And that's the reason that Christians teach that God is through with the Jew. And, you know, I've told you this before, that people like Martin Luther was tremendously anti-Semitic. He hated the Jews. And it was coming from a religious point of view because, you know, they all felt, all the reformers, that the Jews killed the Messiah. But that's not what Scripture says. You know what Scripture does say? You know who killed the Messiah? God. It's all His plan. Now, Martin Luther came up with some good concepts, but that wasn't one of them. Now, remember, Paul is writing to Gentiles. The book of Romans is written to the believers at Rome. And he starts out this way. Romans 10:1, brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they might be saved. Now, what did Paul say back in chapter 9? He said that he would even give up his own salvation if he could see the entire nation saved. He said, for I bear them record that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. So he's talking to Jews there. But you know what? Same thing exists in the Christian church today. Many of these Christian churches out there have zeal. I know Catholics who never miss a Mass service. I know Christians who go to church every Sunday. The doors open in the church and they're there. They have no knowledge, though, of the Scriptures. They're totally ignorant. And, you know, it really boggles my mind that the Catholic Church, when I was a kid, would not even allow people to have a Bible in their house. You had to have catechism. You had to study that book. You had to be brainwashed by them. Now, Romans 10:3 says, for they, being ignorant of God's righteousness, and going about to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted themselves unto the righteousness of God. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone that believeth. Anything ambiguous there? Anything that's not just plain black and white? What Paul is saying here is that all you've got to do for salvation is have faith. But they're all trying to do it with their own works, just like the Catholics do. Totally leaving faith out of the picture. And my job is to constantly remind you that that's where most of the people on the earth are today. They got to do this, they got to do that, they got to do whatever their denomination tells them they have to do. And they do it according to rote. They don't do it according to faith. It's all ritual, it's all tradition. And it's all going to be for nothing. They may as well stay home. And Israel was no different. They kept those feast days, they wouldn't miss a Sabbath for anything. They followed all the sacrifices, they followed the law to a T, but they didn't have faith. And in Hebrews, Paul writes, without faith it's impossible to please God. And that was just as true in the Old Testament economy as it is today. So Christ was the object of faith that Israel was expected to embrace. He came proving who he was for 3 years. They should have known who he was. Well, Micah 5:2 predicted he would be born in Bethlehem. Everybody knew where he was born, in Bethlehem. Come on, people, put 2 and 2 together. Do you know that Jesus Christ fulfilled over 360 distinct prophecies out of the Old Testament? And people, those Sadducees and Pharisees, they knew their Old Testament. You think Saul of Tarsus didn't know? But I got a feeling that God blinded them. I mean, if they knew their Bible like they thought they did, they should have been able to recognize him at a second. The second he began his ministry. But why didn't they? They didn't know their Bible. And here they had this guy, John the Baptist, proclaiming that the day of the Lord is nigh, that he's here. You think they would be a little excited about that and maybe try and figure out who is he, where is he, be happy about the fact that he's around? But you know what, folks? That wasn't in God's plan. Yeah, God's plan was to have the nation of Israel reject their Messiah. God's plan was to have Jesus Christ, his son, go to the Roman cross. God's plan was to have him die, be buried, and rise from the dead. God's plan was to have Jews continue for the next 7 years to reject the message of the Messiah. And then God's plan was to finally turn to a chosen vessel, Saul of Tarsus, to bring all of this new information that he was taught out there in the Sinai desert to the Gentiles, to pull out a people for his name. That's the plan. That's the plan, people. The plan was to eventually allow salvation for the entire population, the entire world, the entire earth. That's God's plan. You know what? Let's go to Luke for a minute. I wasn't going to do this, but I think this is apropos. Luke 21. And drop down to verse 25, and watch what this says. And there shall be signs in the sun, and in the moon, and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations, with perplexity, the sea and waves roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear, and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth, for the powers of heaven shall be shaken. Now what does that mean? They have problems that they have no answer for. The whole world is just full of it. Just in the last couple of days, you see what's going on over in Israel, right? Syria's blasting rockets into the West Bank and the Golan Heights. The whole world is in turmoil. People are trying to solve the Middle East problem with a two-state solution, giving some land to the Palestinians, giving some land to the Jews. And the Jews are willing to do that. But guess what? God doesn't want them giving his land away. You remember when Ariel Sharon was ready to give all of the West Bank and all of the Golan Heights back to back to the Palestinians. You know what happened, right? He was ready to sign it. He had a major stroke, and about 8 months later he died. People, it's going to happen. You're not going to take over God's plan. So, most of you are familiar with this passage in Matthew, and I wanted to go over this with you a little bit. Go ahead and go to Matthew. This is Matthew 24. This is a terrific passage. But as the days of Noah were, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. And we're seeing an introduction for it as time goes by. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, they were marrying and giving in marriage, and knew not until the flood came and took them all away, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but there's intense activity on the earth and nothing's slowing down. And then I read every once in a while about these tremendous amounts of money that people spend to get married. It's not unusual for a wealthy Jew to spend $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 on their kid's funeral, or on their kid's wedding. Freudian slip there. Pretty amazing, and it's not just over there, it's the same thing here. My wife's nephew just had his wedding about 2 years ago. He's already divorced. But those kids spent, I would say, probably easily $50,000 on the wedding. And I don't know, you remember how I taught you about the flood? It wasn't just the water coming up gradually from 40 days of rain. That didn't happen. I mean, it happened. But what happened was the earth broke up. The foundations of the deep split. And everything that was underground, all that water, was instantaneous destruction. Those poor people never knew what hit them. And here in Matthew 24, 37 through 39, you got an indication of how it's going to happen again. We have these events that are leading up to the end times, and you got to know about them. I mean, if America cannot be enlightened, who can be? We've got more for us, more technology, more ability than any other people on the planet. But are we? Are you? It just seems to me that nobody really gives a care out there. And it blows my mind. I mean, we're only here for a short period of time, and then there's eternity. Well, you got two choices. You can go to heaven or you can go to hell. What do you want to do? Romans 10:5, for Moses describeth the righteousness which is of the law, that the man which doeth those things shall live by them. What things? The Mosaic system of law. But the Mosaic system of law had no faith. It was rules, it was regulations, it was law. They couldn't take either one by themselves. It wasn't faith plus nothing like we have. Their works would never amount to anything if it wasn't with faith. They had to do things, these are the Jews now, they had to do things that God said to do under the law because they believed that it was God said. But most of them, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, perfect examples. They all leave the faith element out and just do the works. And the same exact thing happens in Christianity today, the Catholic Church, for prime example. People are doing works. Lots of Protestants too. Let me tell you, I belong to a couple of denominational Protestant churches, and they were predominantly work-related. Very few spiritual people in those churches. One of the groups that were there were the big hat ladies. Every Sunday they would go to church, see who had the biggest hat. Crazy, right? They were liars, they were cheaters. When it was time to vote for a new pastor one time, the church ladies, the big hat ladies, took charge, and there were two candidates. And the candidate I wanted was the scriptural candidate, the candidate who was ready to teach or lead us biblically, and the other was not. He was more secular. And when the vote was taken, the big hat ladies announced from the pulpit that their candidate had won, and that was it. Washed their hands. And I stood up and I said, excuse me. Now, I was brand new to this church. They didn't really know much about me. I said, I'd like to see those ballots. And you should have seen the stares, man. If looks could kill, I would be dead, sliced by 1,000 cuts. Anyway, I stormed up to the altar. I grabbed the pot, or the pail that these ballots were in. I started counting them one by one. And do you know that the candidate that I wanted had won by almost 2/3? And those ladies just outright lied, right there in church at the altar, because they didn't want this person to be the pastor. And the funny thing was, when their deception was found out, you think they would apologize? No, they doubled down. They pulled the pastor aside the first Sunday that pastor was to preach. And they said, okay, look, this is what you can preach about. We don't want to hear anything about being born again. So, first sermon that the pastor did was on being born again. And it just so happened that most of the men in that church were Masons. They were members of the Masonic Order, secret society. And second sermon that preacher preached was how Jesus hated secret societies. I mean, that pastor, that preacher, did not make himself very popular with those big hat ladies. And they made that pastor's life miserable. But we fought it through. And I digress. So I want to go to Romans 6 right now, and Paul writing, but the righteousness which is of faith, that means the righteousness that comes by simply believing. That the righteousness which is of faith speaketh on this wise. It means it says this, say not this in thine heart, who shall ascend into heaven. That is, or it means to bring Christ down from above, or who shall descend into the deep. That means to bring Christ up from the dead. But what does it say? The word is nigh thee, even in thy mouth and in thy heart. That is the word of faith which we preach. Now, what Paul is saying here is you don't have to go to some high mountain to find Jesus. You don't have to go to some, valley to find Jesus. Where is Jesus? He's right in front of you. I always love to go back to John's Gospel, chapter 10. Go ahead and go there. And this is a great illustration. Christ is using himself as a shepherd of the sheep. But not only is he the shepherd, he is the door to the sheepfold. Here's what it says in John. Now, if you guys got a red letter Bible, this is red letter. Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that entereth not by the door into the sheepfold, but climbeth up some other way, that same is a thief and a robber. Now, the way I've always read that, from the time I started reading the Bible, is a picture of somebody trying to steal a sheep or a lamb, right? But that's not what it means. There's a spiritual connotation to this, and what he's telling us is that people who try to gain heaven other than the way he prescribes are going to be cast out as thieves and robbers. John 2, 10, 2, 3. But he that entereth by the door, that's him, is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the porter openeth, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calleth his own sheep by name, and he leadeth them out. Now go all the way down to verse 6. Watch this. Verse 6 and 7. This parable spake Jesus unto them. So now Jesus is talking to his own people, right? The people of Israel. But they understood not what things they were which he spake unto them. Why? They were blind. They were ignorant. So Jesus now has to clarify this. Then Jesus said unto them again, Verily, verily, I say unto you, I am the door of the sheep. So he's telling them here that he's the only way. And it's no different today. But they try and come in every other way except the way Jesus gave us. Now, I don't know whether I taught you this or not, but I want to put this in here. Where was the door of the sheepfold? Was it way up on some sheer cliff? Was it across a raging river? No, it's right out in front of people, right at ground level where anybody could just walk through. And you remember the analogy I made, back 2 or 3 months ago, of riding your kayak down the river of life. You see all those doors on the side, on the shores, and every one of them says, whosoever will may come. And if you get out of your boat and you walk through the door and you close it behind you, you know what's written on the other side? Chosen before the foundation of the world. It's exactly what Paul is saying here in Romans chapter 10. You don't have to ascend someplace and bring Christ down to your level like the Catholics do every day, where you can approach him. You don't have to bring him up from the deep. He's right in front of you. Now, I always get this question, Jimmy, what about people who've never heard the gospel? They never heard 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 4. And I'm sure when people think about this, they think about people in darkest Africa or South America or anywhere where it's remote. They're lost, right? But the book says that every man that comes into this world has been enlightened. Go to John's Gospel, I'm going to show you this. And I've been reading this Gospel, this verse, over and over again, and I never caught it. I totally missed it for all these years. And this is why I say that, you can't comprehend this book in its totality. Every once in a while, something pops out that you just haven't seen before. But this book is written by a sovereign God. And a sovereign God is never going to allow anyone to go to their eternal doom without cause. So the verse I'm quoting here is speaking of Jesus coming in his first advent, as John the Baptist is announcing him. And John 1:9 says this, That was the true light, which every man that cometh into the world lighteth. Now, when I saw that, I thought, I'd never seen that before. Gee, how many times have people asked me about these people who never hear the gospel? Now go to Romans 1:18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who hold the truth in unrighteousness, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God hath showed it to them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Who's without excuse? Every single human. No human ever born comes into life on this planet without having the light that God's given him. So they're going to be held responsible for it. Now go back to Romans 10:8. But what saith it, the Scriptures? The word is nigh, even in thy mouth. Now, Paul is writing from Holy Spirit here. This isn't just a casual statement. It means what it says, that the word is there for the taking, and all people have to do is take it. Because the word says that they refuse to step into the light, because the light is going to reveal what they're really made of, that they don't want to see or hear, that they want to reject the light, they want to go to their doom. And they don't have to, because Jesus Christ tasted death for every man. In 2 Corinthians 5. Watch this. You've heard this before. For the love of Christ constraineth us, because we thus judge that if one died for all, then we're all dead. Now, people, that's not something Jimmy Sedore made up. It's what the book says. And you got to understand that. Now, back to Romans 8. We're almost done. But what saith it? The word is nigh thee, even in thy mouth and in thy heart. The word of faith. The word of faith. Not the word of works, not the word of legalism. The word of faith. Just believing. Now, let's finish up here in Romans 1:16. And people, this says it all right here. Paul writing, for I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it, his gospel, is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth. Period. Does it say everyone that believeth and honors the Sabbath? Does it say everyone that believeth and obeyeth the law? Does it say everyone that believeth and gets baptized? Does it say everyone that believeth and honors the holy days? No. Our gospel, Gentile gospel, Paul's gospel, the age of grace gospel, is that the gospel of Christ is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that simply believes it. So that's going to do it for today's teaching. I hope you enjoyed that. This is Jim Sedore. I am your personal Bible teacher, and you're listening to the Bible Exposition channel. I hope you'll have a great day. God bless. Hey, this is Jim Sedore. I am your personal Bible teacher. If you like what you hear, and you think your friends and relatives would benefit by the teaching, please share it with everyone you know. Thanks, and have a great day.